Good morning. Buenos días. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Marisol Viña, and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the California Endowment. And I am excited to welcome you all to our first Policy Perspectives webinar of the year, the proposed state budget and what to know for 2024. Policy Perspectives is a virtual space that brings together experts and partners to help us break down state and federal policy issues that impact our state and our communities. As a reminder, these webinars are nonpartisan and non-political informational sessions. So as we know, the state budget has significant impacts on our lives and our communities, not only because it allocates dollars for various programs and systems, but also because a lot of policy decisions are made through the budget process. And as you may have heard, Governor Newsom released his proposed state budget on January 10th and started the months-long budget process. Deliberations, public hearings, and negotiations with the legislature will take place in the coming months and will continue until the parties get to a final agreed-upon budget by the constitutional deadline of June 15th. An important part of those deliberations will revolve around how to close a significant budget deficit that California is facing, and we'll hear more about that from our speakers today. So today's webinar, which is a collaboration with some of our amazing partners, the California Budget and Policy Center and California Advocacy, will provide us a high-level overview of the budget, including the magnitude of the budget deficit, what it means for some key areas, and how the governor proposes to address the budget gap. And to provide that overview, we will first be joined by Chris Haney, the Executive Director of the California Budget and Policy Center. And the team at the center is our go-to source on all things state budget. And we are so pleased that we have Chris with us today. After we hear about the budget, we will pause for questions and then shift to the second part of the webinar, which will provide an overview of the role of the legislature in the process, timelines, and insight into the new leadership in the Assembly and the Senate. And to help us learn about those changes, we will be joined by Marvin Pineda, who's the Director of Legislative and Regulatory Affairs at California Advocacy. And he will share some insights on what we should know about the legislature and its processes as the budget season starts. After the presentations, we will have time for Q&A. And so a couple of reminders before we get started. We encourage you all to engage in the conversation by posting your questions in the chat, as we will have an opportunity for questions after the presentations. Also know that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available along with the slides and speaker bios after the event. All right, so that's all for reminders. And now let's get to the program. Happy to welcome Chris.
Great, thanks Marisol. Thanks for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. I'm with the California Budget and Policy Center. We're a nonprofit organization that seeks to build a more just and equitable California by producing analyses and policy advocacy support that helps improve budget decisions so that we get more equitable outcomes for Californians. And what I'm going to do today is give you a bit of an overview of the budget and the governor's proposals. I'll do the kind of overall landscape assessment about the fiscal outlook and how the governor proposes to solve a budget deficit and give you a sense of that deficit. And then I'm going to talk about some of the specific proposals that are in the governor's budget in a few areas like housing and health and justice system and various areas. And so, and we'll take some Q&A as well. So let's start with that budget overview. And I'm going to start in terms of that overview by just giving you a sense of the fiscal outlook. So let's go through a few details there. The governor projects a $58 billion deficit, and I want to stress that this is not just for the coming fiscal year that starts in July. It's actually over 3 years. The prior fiscal year that we just ended back in June, 2022-23, the current fiscal year, 23-24, and then the budget next year that would start in July. So this is what the people in the legislature and the administration call the budget window. So it's over a 3-year period. You probably, if you followed the news, heard the governor say that he thought the deficit was $38 billion, and you're wondering maybe why I'm saying it's 58. The reason we're saying 58 is because The governor did already have some proposed solutions to the deficit that he didn't include in his total. And when you have some of those solutions added, his deficit looks more like 58 billion. So we think that's the more accurate number to go with. To understand why there is a deficit after we had surpluses not so long ago, what you need to understand is that the deficit is a result to declining tax collections or revenues the state has that are based on taxes we all filed and corporations filed in 2022, which probably seems a long time ago. The first thing to understand there is that 2022 was a down year for the stock market and economy. It was when the Federal Reserve started to raise interest rates, which had a really dramatic effect on the stock market. And when things affect the stock market, the state's revenues either go up because things are going really well, or they go down really quickly because the stock market's declining. So what happened in 2022 is the revenue that particularly high income earners make off the stock market, revenue that the income that the corporation sector gets, all were declining. We would have normally known that mid 2023 in time to solve for some of that in the budget that we have for this fiscal year. But you might remember that the federal government and the state both allowed Californians to file their taxes late in October of 2023, which means we didn't really find out about this revenue problem until late this last year. And so that's why this deficit looks so large, is it's sort of we're having to resolve a deficit that cuts across a couple of years. One thing I also want to note is that both the legislative analyst office that works for the legislature and the Department of Finance that works for the administration say that they have out-year projections of ongoing shortfalls. I think we should all be careful to caveat that a bit. It's really hard for them to project revenues, and it's really hard for them to project what happens with the stock market. And so there's a lot of unknowns there. We're going to get a better picture of what the revenues actually look like come April and May when people file their taxes for the 2023 tax year. So there's still a lot to be determined there in terms of what those out-year projections look like. So that does it for the fiscal outlook. I do want to share a few key messages that my organization is sharing with advocates and policymakers, which is we think the state budget should prioritize the well-being of Californians, regardless of whether we're in surplus or deficit. The budget itself is not an outcome. It's a statement of our values, and its goal is to actually produce outcomes that improve lives for Californians, and you have to do that even when times are tough. The budget shortfall and how state leaders have tended to approach it often threatens essential public services, and the reason for that is that state leaders don't use all of the tools that they might have to address the shortfall, particularly revenue options, and we can talk more about that as we go here. But there are currently in the governor's proposal very few revenue options that would help address the problem, and state leaders are sometimes reticent to take on tax and revenue issues during down years, even when there are shortfalls. Now I wanted to share a little bit about some of the solutions. This is a quick overview of what the governor proposes to do with the deficit. So the first category is he actually proposes a series of what I'm going to call just budget maneuvers. These are sort of wonky technical things. The first to understand is that we have and I'll say more about this on education a little bit later, but whenever our revenues decline or go up, the automatic guarantee that we have for K through 12 schools and community colleges also adjusts. That's a minimum guarantee that's set by formula in the state constitution. So the fact that revenues went down means there's an automatic reduction in funding for K through 14. That looks like it's about $14 billion, according to the governor. So that's one solution that just triggers right away. The governor proposes to use $18.8 billion in reserves, or what we often call rainy day funds. So it's about half of what the state has in reserves right now, leaving the rest of that for use in a future year or future years. And then there's some internal borrowing and fund shifts, which is just a technical way of saying that there's some things the state can do to shift money around between what we call special funds that are things outside of the state's general fund, which is its main, essentially, checking account, because those special funds sometimes have surpluses, and we can temporarily borrow from them and then pay the funds back when revenues look better overall in the general fund. So these are just sort of technical maneuvers people use when this sort of thing happens. I think more importantly for all of us who are tracking what's happening with how they solve the budget is that there are also proposed cuts, delays, and deferrals. So there's $8.5 billion in the governor's proposal for actual reductions in services, or what you would just probably casually call cuts. I'll talk more about some of those in a few minutes. There's a little over $7 billion in delays and deferrals. These are things where the state made earlier commitments in earlier budget years, and the state basically is saying if those funds haven't been spent, we're going to pull back some of those funds and reduce them, or we're going to shift them into future years, like 25, 26, or 2026, 27. The other piece that's not really outlined in the governor's proposal, but has come to light, is that there's also $8 billion in potential cuts to the part of the budget that are not the Prop 98 guarantee. And that guarantee is that education guarantee that I was mentioning. I'll say more about this in a little bit, but basically there's a proposal from the governor to protect some funding for K through 12 and community colleges, but the protection of that funding actually means there'll have to be cuts in other parts of the budget. Like I said, I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So let's talk about how this kind of looks overall in terms of solutions. The Legislative Analyst's Office has a chart that in the next slide that this is how they kind of outline the different things that are a picture of what I just shared with you all. And I'm not asking you all to sort of dig into what's in this chart. What I want to do is just note that the one sliver that's in orange here that says additional revenue shows you that there's not much of what the governor is proposing that actually shifts revenue. We have our own version of this chart in the next slide that actually kind of makes this picture a little clearer. So of all the solutions in the governor's budget, there's a tiny percentage that's actually using revenue options. And instead, the way they're proposing to resolve the budget deficit is to use various sorts of spending cuts and use reserves and some of those other technical budget measures. And so they're using some of the tools, but they're not using all the tools they might use to resolve the budget deficit. Moving on from there, let's talk a little bit issue area by issue area. This is the first area I want to talk about is housing and homelessness. And I do want to note that in terms of those spending reductions and deferrals and delays, the areas that are hardest hit in the governor's budget are areas like infrastructure, climate change, and housing and homelessness. Although there aren't a tremendous amount of cuts in housing and homelessness, it's more that there's just less progress that's been made given the intensity of the need in this arena. So let's walk through a few of the specific proposals. In terms of homelessness, there's no new funding to end homelessness. The governor's administration maintains a little over $1 billion in what's called the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Grant Program. This is a grant program that actually provides funds to local governments to help address homelessness. We're in round 5 of this in terms of the funding that the state's provided. So the year 5 of the grant program, notably the governor's proposal doesn't propose a year 6. So that's another concern because when we get done with the current round of grants, it means there won't be additional funding. And some additional bonus funding that the state had proposed to put into this program is actually being delayed into future years. There's also a few delays or shifts for other homelessness programs that are a part of the overall budget solution. So nothing new in the homelessness arena, and also some delays in a few key areas. The next slide is going to talk briefly about what's in the affordable housing investment space overall. In this space, the governor is proposing to cut over $1 billion in previously allocated funding for various programs and does not propose an additional $500 million for low-income housing tax credits, which has been something the state has been doing on a one-time basis each year since 2019. So basically that additional funding would be closing out in the next fiscal year, and there'd be some funding that's been cut overall for affordable housing. So this is one of the ways that the funding is actually, this is one of those places in the budget where there are real cuts and reductions and delays happening. So let's move on to health. In the health arena, there's some good news, which is the governor's proposal maintains its commitment to expand full scope Medi-Cal coverage to undocumented Californians ages 26 to 49. So this is the group of Californians who are undocumented who previously haven't been able to access the state's health insurance program for folks with low incomes. Now they'll be able to do that. This was enacted last year. It's been in the works for several years. The governor's maintaining the financial commitment to that expansion. He's also sustaining efforts to reform Medi-Cal and improve the behavioral health service delivery systems. So that's all good news. And he's seeking early action from the legislature to increase the managed care organization tax, which is a tax on healthcare systems, which actually allows the state to fund some of these Medi-Cal expansions. So the Medi-Cal arena stays largely untouched after a number of years of really significant improvements. That isn't to say that there aren't some cuts or reductions in the health arena, and most of those are coming related to workforce. So in this next slide, I'll talk a little bit about that. The budget does not include funding to start raising the statewide minimum wage for healthcare workers. So this was a deal the legislature, governor, and the labor community reached late last year, where they were going to raise the statewide minimum wage for certain healthcare workers to $25 an hour. They're walking that back already here early in 2024, saying they're going to renegotiate that. Nobody knows exactly what that looks like, but there's not funding for it so far in the governor's proposal. There's also delays in nursing and social work initiatives that were designed to address workforce shortfalls, and similarly, some delays in workforce-related initiatives in the behavioral health arena. So this is one of those areas where there's some kind of significant delays to future years, and the delay in a deal that was struck just late last year. I'll do a little bit to walk through education, and I want to make sure you understand the earlier issue I was talking about with $8 billion in cuts to non-education parts of the budget because of what's happening in education. So on this next slide, just big picture, what's happening. Funding for K through 14 education, because we have this minimum guarantee built into the Constitution, is going to be reduced by $14 million. I want to stress this isn't like a discretionary choice that state leaders are making. This happens by formula when the revenues go down for the state. The Prop 98 minimum guarantee for K through 12 and community colleges goes down. There was significant changes in the last year that affect the cost of education overall. Last year's the budget agreement included a cost of living adjustment of over 8% for K through 14 education's main funding formulas. That cost the state about $4 billion a year. In a minute, I'll tell you why that's important. There's also some one-time withdrawals and one-time fundings from a reserve fund that's specifically devoted to K through 12 schools and community colleges. So we have a rainy day fund that had built up money over the years, and one of the ways the governor backfills some of the potential loss in K through 14 funding is to pull money out of that reserve. In order to do that, the governor and the legislature are going to have to take some early action. So you're going to see something happen on this front in the next couple of months before we actually get to when the budget has to be enacted in late June of this year. Now, in the next slide, what I want to tell you about a little bit is about why there's this $8 billion problem. And this is something that was kind of not outlined very well in the governor's budget. But last year's budget agreement, the one that governs the year that we're in now, because it included this cost of living adjustment, costs the state $4 billion annually, and that affects both 22-23 and 23-24, the current fiscal year. So it's about $8 billion. The governor is proposing to maintain that $8 billion in K through 14 spending rather than reduce it as part of the overall K through 14 reduction. The problem for that is that there isn't a way to pay for that, and so the state leaders are going to have to solve for that $8 billion by making cuts in other parts of the budget, which means everything other than education, in the next fiscal year and future years. And the governor doesn't say how he proposes to do that. It's already come up in a couple of hearings as a really significant issue that state legislative leaders are pushing back on. And it's certainly a concern for folks in the economic security and safety net spaces, housing and homelessness, infrastructure, et cetera, where there's some concern that there's some other cuts that governor hasn't been proposing that might still be coming. And so this is an area to watch in terms of the debate that happens in the coming months. In terms of the last issue area I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide or two about the justice system and the changes that are made there. The first is that sorry, the title on this slide is wrong. I copied it over from a previous presentation. Ignore the title. I'm just going to go through the bullets here. In the prison system, the main source of spending at the state level, the governor's proposal maintains current plans for prison closures that were called for in earlier years, but doesn't call for any additional prison closures. There's also some savings from earlier enactment of Proposition 47, which basically reduced sentences for some crimes and moved some crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, and all of that saves the state some funding. Governor estimates that's almost $90 million for the next fiscal year. And then the last thing, the big attention in this space is around responding to retail and commercial theft. The governor has his own proposals to address that in 24-25 by strengthening some of the ways we prosecute retail theft. But he doesn't notably try to reduce or weaken Prop 47, which is what some folks who are concerned about retail theft had been calling for. The governor says that's not really where the solution lies, and that there's some other ways we can strengthen the justice system to approach what's happening in terms of retail and commercial theft concerns that are out there. So not a ton of news here in the justice system space, but there is the place I think to watch is probably the retail theft and Prop 47 debate as it goes forward. So last couple things to just share here. Want to talk a little bit just about the sort of mainline messages here again, which is to make sure that we share that California has a wealth and state leaders have the tools and resources to further protect essential services and build upon earlier progress. We still have to make progress, regardless of whether we're in surplus or deficit. And that means that we have to make the case for continuing to protect investments in Californians. Also just want to share that if you want to find out more about what's happening with the budget, where we are in a few months, the Budget Center has an annual conference. You can see a little bit in this next slide. That'll be April 16th in Sacramento. It includes advocates, organizers, folks from philanthropy, people who are interested in public policy in California. So we're doing a lot of work on just outlining the state budget proposals at that conference. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take some questions. I know there's probably some things that have been in the chat. I haven't been able to track that. So Marisol, I assume you'll help me figure out where the interest lies. Yes. We'll do our best.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for that very informative overview. I know that was a lot. So we do have some questions on the chat, but we also received some early questions from some of our audience, and I want to appreciate you all for doing that, those that took the time to do that. And we will have a time at the end also for some of the questions that are on the chat, but I did want to ask you one question that came early. And this is related to, what, in your perspective, what do you think needs to happen to bring the state back into a surplus?
The main thing that brings us back into surplus is that the economy is doing well, stock market is doing well, because we have a tax system that asks people who earn a lot more to pay a lot more in taxes, a progressive tax system, as we call it. So when our highest income earners, who make most of their income and wealth from stock market gains, are experiencing a good stock market, the state's revenues go up dramatically. The same tends to happen with large corporations. We had a pretty good year in 2023 overall in terms of stock market gains. That's a good sign for what might be coming. But it wasn't the same kind of year as we had in 2020 and 2021, where we had really big gains. We saw really large increases in state revenues. We had surpluses. I think the current year, based on the prior year's tax collections, could be a little more bumpy and rough. If 2024, the year we're in now, turns out to be a good year, and most people are expecting right now that it would be, because the Federal Reserve is expected to lower interest rates, then that could bode well for future surpluses. So that's why I said at the beginning to be careful about some of these concerns about out-year shortfalls. It's really easy for state leaders to predict costs of services because we know what current services look like and the cost of maintaining them. It's really hard to project the revenue side.
Thank you, Chris. And then there's a clarifying question, I think, from Maribel on the chat as to whether the state legislature can still advocate to add back the $500 million back to low-income housing credits. Was that Do you
Yes,
know if that's right?
absolutely. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Everything that the governor has proposed is on the table for the legislature to push back on. They'll have their own plans. Each house of the legislature will have their own bill that they'll be putting forward with their own proposals. I'm sure Marvin's going to talk a little bit about that process-wise. I think there's already pushback happening behind the scenes on some of these proposals, particularly housing, homelessness, this issue of this $8 billion that might need to be cut from non-education programs. So this is certainly not resolved by any stretch. And it's a process to work through as we get to May and the governor gets to put out his second proposal.
Great, thank you. And then, and we can talk more about behavioral health, but there's a question in the chat about, are there conversations underway to revisit the decision to delay/cut to increases in behavioral health / mental health beds? This effort goes hand in hand with homelessness prevention.
Right. Yeah, there is certainly going to be pushback, and I think there's going to be both. The pushback is going to come in the interaction between what the governor is proposing in the budget and what the governor has proposed in Proposition 1, the ballot measure that's going to be on the March primary ballot. Because that ballot measure includes a component that would actually move some funding in county mental and behavioral health systems into being able to be used for housing purposes, there's some concern that it's reducing actual funding for mental and behavioral health services. And then if the governor is making cuts in the state budget, that's, they're taking a hit on two fronts. So I think the interaction of those two things is where the legislature is going to push back, given that Prop 1 is on the ballot, the governor is making a big push behind it, and it's polling pretty well with voters. So I think there's a lot of concerns in the county mental health space about what that means for how they fund things.
Got it. Okay, thank you, Chris. And we will have more time at the end for more questions. Chris will join us back up. But now we're gonna pivot to Marvin Pineda, who will give us an overview of the role of the legislature and give us some insight on what is to come with the changes in leadership in the Assembly and the Senate. Marvin.
Yeah, thank you, Marisol, and thank you, Chris, for that update. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and Happy New Year's. It's still January 31st. I would be presenting on key legislative dates, leadership changes in the legislature, and some priorities that the legislature has identified in response to the governor's proposed budget. There's been a strong response both from the Assembly and the Senate on what has been proposed. First, I like to do a quick overview of the role of the legislature in the budget process. As we all know, the governor proposed his budget on January 10th. After having legislative hearings and receiving input from all stakeholders, the legislature is the one that adopts the final budget. The governor can veto budget items, but he cannot add any funding to any item. That's the negotiations have to go back and forth, which we know would take a lot of months. We expect the legislature will have over 80 budget hearings to discuss all the different parts of the budget. And they'll start happening as early February. Now I'd like to discuss key budget legislative dates. I know Chris touched on some of these. We know about January 10th, the governor releasing his budget. On January 23rd, the Assembly and Senate budget committees had their first hearings to review the governor's proposed budget. From February to May, all the budget subcommittees will have public hearings. And I want to make a note to all the community groups and all the organizations out there. The public no longer has the option of providing testimony via phone. It's all, the testimony is all in person committee. April 15th, which I won't touch, it's an important date, it's a tax deadline for a lot of us. May 14th, the governor will issue his May revisions. And then on June 15th is the deadline for the legislature to pass its budget. It's a very short period of time where there's going to be a lot of conversations, a lot of negotiations. And then we have July 1 as the start of the 2024 fiscal year. Now we've seen a lot of change in the leadership in the Assembly, and now we're going to start seeing that in the Senate also. In the Assembly, we have our newly elected Assembly Speaker, Robert Rivas from Salinas. Grew up in farm worker housing, knows about the agricultural and rural community. Some of his past priorities have been farm worker protections, environmental justice, and housing. Staying in the Assembly, we have Speaker Rivas appointing Jesse Gabriel from Woodland Hills in Southern California as the budget chair. Now, I'd like to walk everybody through some of the budget changes that happen in the Assembly structure. So that is, we have 2 new budget subcommittees. As the number of Democrats continues to grow, it looks like some of the number of committees also continue to grow. Budget subcommittee number 2 is new, and that's going to focus solely on human services. That is now separate from subcommittee number 1 on health. And we have subcommittee number 2 being chaired by Assemblymember Jackson, who has a long history of helping those that are in need. We have a new committee also. It's budget subcommittee number 7, which will focus on accountability and oversight on all the investments that have been made by the legislature in the past. That would be chaired by Assemblymember Abelino Valencia. These are the 2 returning chairs in the budget subcommittees. So Dr. Weber from San Diego returns the subject as budget subcommittee number 1 on health. Bennett returns as chair of budget subcommittee number 2 on climate crisis, resource energy and transportation. The important thing about this, both they carry a lot of influence both from an environmental issue and healthcare. We have the following new chairs for Assembly budget subcommittees. David Alvarez is the chair for budget subcommittee number 3 on education. And I will talk about some of those, some of their priorities that they've to focus on. Assemblymember Craig Silva is the new chair for budget subcommittee number 5 on state administration. And then we have Assemblymember James Ramos, who's the chair for budget subcommittee number 6 on public safety. The new Assembly budget committee members are Flora, Ortega, Ward, Wilson, and Spur. All great members with a long history of helping those that are in need. In the Senate, we haven't seen much movement in the Senate, but we will see the transition start happening this coming Monday, February 5th. Senator McGuire will be sworn in as the new pro tem. Senate Resolution 16 was introduced yesterday, which will be voted on Monday to officially elect Senator McGuire. Now, Senator McGuire automatically leaves his majority leader position as he becomes pro tem, which means that he has to appoint somebody immediately to that position, which we expect will have a domino effect, and we will see a lot of changes to both budget and policy committees in the Senate this coming week. Now I'd like to focus on the priorities. What's on the legislature's mind? What are they thinking? We've seen the 2 hearings that both the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee had on the same day. A lot of disagreements back and forth on what should be a priority. Some of the priorities they have out of the Assembly are maintaining classroom spending, ensuring that there are no teacher layoffs, there are no other school employee layoffs, so protecting children is a priority. Student housing, as we know, that's the legislature has indicated they do not want that to be delayed. Healthcare expansion, which is something that a lot of groups have worked on, it continues to be a priority. But again, it's a lot of hard decisions, and all indications are that that's going to stay intact. Now, some of the most needy, the Assembly has indicated that they will focus on, and they'll ensure to protect CalWorks, CalFresh, SSI, SSP. Again, thus protecting the most needy. Preserving funding for that developmental services people with disabilities. Again, there's some delays on that. The legislature wants to push back. And then I think I want to bring this theme up. It's something that Assemblymember Ramos always brings up, and now as he's chair of Budget Sub 5, that is bringing attention to and resources to the murder and disappearance of Native American women and Native American people in California. That's going to be a priority. The other priority would be preventing cutting victim services. That the legislature feels that it's strongly needed. Now on the Senate, we have the Senate is their theme last year was protect our progress, meaning investments that were made during the surplus after their hearings. That's the same theme. They want to be able to continue to protect healthcare, housing, homelessness, very similar to the Assembly. And then I like to focus on caucus priorities. The caucus will continue to put their priorities forward. The Latino caucus, the Women caucus, the Black caucus, the API caucus, the Jewish caucus, LGBT caucus, they all have their own internal deadlines of when they will decide what they would put forward to the leadership in the governor's office. The last minute I would like to spend on local funding requests. The governor proposed to reduce funds to local initiatives by $350 million. The governor did not identify any of those priorities that would be reduced. The legislature has indicated that they want to protect these investments as nonprofits and local governments depend on this funding. Many nonprofits and local governments are counting on the legislature's investment to provide services to the most needy. So that's going to be a lot of back and forth. New budget requests. That's something that it's always in everybody's minds. It's always in my mind. After having conversations within the legislature, I think it's fair to say that advocating for your organization and for your needs is always important, whether it's a good budget year or a bad budget year. This year is a bad budget year, but that doesn't mean that your work will not be counted for as you're laying the groundwork for the future and to have success for the future when we have a good budget year. With that, I would like to close my remarks and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, Marvin, for that really good overview of what we can expect with the new changes in the legislature. So now I want to invite Chris back, and Marvin, don't go away. We are going to now transition into additional questions that we have from the chat. I want to thank everyone for their questions. So there's been just several questions related to climate and environmental justice and what that looks like in the budget. So Chris, I was wondering if you might be able to do a high-level overview. I know you also shared your resource in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that. But maybe if you could share a high-level overview on what the climate budget looks like, that would be wonderful. And Marvin, you're also welcome to chime in.
Yeah, happy to do that. It's in one of those areas that's hit most dramatically by the changes in proposals. And I want to start by saying one of the reasons for that is in 2020 and 2021, when the state had really large surpluses, one of the ways that they spent those funds was to make big investments on one-time bases into climate infrastructure and climate change and adaptation programs. So there was, according to the governor, there was somewhere in the neighborhood of around $50 billion that was committed over a couple of year period. They really stressed that those were one-time funds and they were spending them if they had the funding. And what we're now experiencing is that they don't have the funding. And so they're saying we have to pull back on some of that. So it's not, I want people to understand that I don't think they're cutting the programs because they don't value them. They're cutting them because this is a place where they use the surplus funding and now they don't have the funding anymore. And it doesn't mean there isn't a need, but that's why that's there. The places where they're cutting, there's about $7 billion in reductions in climate change related programs. There's about $2 billion of that. It's just overall delays in programs. There's another almost $3 billion in previously allocated climate investments, a little under $2 billion, mainly to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. Some of this is actually going to be shifted over to a special fund as well. So there's some changes there. There's a lot of details under this. So rather than sort of walk through all of the different, there's like 12, 13 different programs affected. I'm going to paste a link in that will take you to our website and have the list of the places where the reductions occur so that I don't have to kind of walk through each of them here in the interest of time.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That is wonderful. Okay, so Marvin, there is a question in the chat about, with the new committee changes, how will the additions of new committees affect the legislative process when finalizing the California budget? And how will these new committees affect the 2024 legislative cycle?
Those new committees, I think at least for sub 2, there's going to be more, and there's more an emphasis on social services, and I think that's going to be important as you have Senator Jackson looking at those, and you have new committee chairs, and I think that the impact that has on the budget negotiations is that you're going to have members that are going to be very passionate. It's their first time around having these budget discussions, and they're used to very good years, and they're going to want to protect the investments that they've made. That's a theme that I've heard over and over, that you have new energy here.
Okay, and there's also been a request to maybe repeat or restate the issue around district requests. And Marvin, you're welcome to
absolutely
repeat, and Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. I could walk through that fast. I know I flew that through probably like 10 seconds. So the governor proposed to reduce funds for local legislative priorities by 350 million. So what does that mean? That means if there was an investment that was made for 15 million over the next 5 years, then that was a district priority that maybe went to a community organization. So that the governor is saying, let's revisit. The legislature's office the legislators are saying we could find other places where we could make reductions because they want to protect those investments. That was an agreement that was reached already on those, and they feel that would be undoing those agreements. So they've indicated they want to protect those. But again, this is where advocacy from community groups and expressing the importance of those requests is important.
You mentioned student housing, and so Elena's asking, are there more details on what's being proposed around the student housing priority that you referenced?
Yeah, and I'd like to have Chris help me out on this one. I know that there's been some delays on the student housing proposals that have been made. And a delay for some folks means it's not going to happen when there's a need now. And that just means you're not building housing when there's a need. But I'll let Chris jump in here with more details if he has any.
Yeah, I don't have more to add in that at the moment. I'm digging through our analysis of that real quick. I know there's been some delays. I don't have the details, but I'm going to look at it. And if we have time, I'll come back around. Sorry.
Yeah,
no problem. That's okay.
Yeah, and it's been a delay for a year or two. That's what it is. So we'll get you the exact number, the amount.
And we'll be sending out resources, and we'll send a slide deck, and we'll be sending, some of the resources that have been referenced here today. So there's also several questions about just additional revenue options that might be considered. So wondered if, either of you have any intel on that, any insight on what might be considered?
Yeah, what we've seen is that there's been some borrowing, as Chris mentioned. There's been some borrowing from the cannabis tax revenue. 100 million has gone to the general fund. So there is some funds out there. Again, some discretion, but it's up to the governor of how much he wants to tap resources like that.
Yeah, there's a little bit of money, as I had in the one chart at the beginning of my presentation, where the governor is doing some small tax changes. They're really not things where he's making a discretionary choice to change taxes for individual taxpayers. It's more the states conforming to changes that have happened at the federal level. And there's been a few changes over the last 4 or 5 years. Those produce a little bit of revenue for the state, but there isn't anything more significant. I think the space where you could see state leaders become convinced they have to do something on revenue over the next few months would likely be in the corporation tax or corporate tax arena. The reason for that is that corporations have done quite well in our state, both pre-pandemic, after the pandemic. They did even surprisingly well despite the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes. And meanwhile, other folks in the state are struggling to make ends meet and, deal with cost of living issues, housing costs in particular. So I think you could see state leaders do a couple of things. I think you could see them try to change the rate structure in the corporate tax system. Last year, the Senate proposed to make a graduated tax rate, which would mean that the very biggest corporations who make the most money would have a higher tax rate than small businesses, and small businesses would then have their rate lowered. The state would have received some additional revenue that it could spend on essential services, and it would make the corporation tax code a little more fair. Also, that proposal didn't go anywhere. The Senate said they will be bringing it back. That hasn't happened yet, but I think as we deal with deficit issues, you could see something like that happen. I think another place you might see some action is oftentimes state leaders during recessions will suspend tax breaks for corporations in particular. So we have a lot of tax breaks for corporations on the books in California. We lose about $80 billion in revenues for tax breaks that go to high wealth individuals and corporations. Oftentimes they will try to suspend those tax breaks for a few years in order for the state to get some additional revenue in order to get through a downturn. My organization thinks that those tax breaks ought to permanently go away. A lot of the big problems with tax breaks are that we never sunset them, we never review them to see if they're working. And so we think a recession or a downturn is a good opportunity for the state to look at those things and say, hey, are they working? Are they efficient? Are there more fair ways we could distribute those revenues? So I think that's probably the most likely arena, at least in the context of the current budget cycle.
Thanks, Chris. And thanks for putting in the answer to the student housing. So it's in the chat. Thank you, Chris. Okay. And then there is a question in terms of the implications for counties. Is that something one of you could speak to?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. The state budget doesn't often break down individual implications in terms of dollar amounts on a county by county basis. So what I'll do is try to speak to that generally. I think the key areas of concern for counties would be in the CalWORKs program, which is the state's welfare to work program, which counties are the major administrators and implementers of, and in the mental and behavioral health space, as Marisol asked about earlier. So on the CalWORKs arena, we didn't talk about this as part of the earlier presentation, but that's actually one of the areas that the governor is proposing to make some significant cuts. And that's a really huge concern for advocates in the safety net arena. It's obviously a big concern for counties who would then lose funding to administer programs that are really vital to low-income communities in their counties. So that's an area to watch. The legislature is already pushing back very hard on that, and so I think we'll see. I don't think that's a done deal just because the governor's proposed it. I suspect the counties will be pushing back hard as well. And then, of course, there's what Marisol asked about earlier, the behavioral health changes where there's reductions in spending that might have gone to workforce needs. That certainly affects what happens in counties. And then there's that interaction with Proposition 1 around whether money goes into mental health or whether it goes into housing. So those are the areas I think counties are watching pretty closely.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for these great questions. I think we have time for maybe one more. And this one relates to K-12. Can you talk about the impact on K-12 schools of the Prop 98 automatic trigger on LCFF funding?
Yeah, I don't have the exact specifics on the sort of what it means for LCFF. So the local control funding formula being asked about is a weighted student formula that determines how the money that is spent on K through 12 schools flows to the school districts. And we changed it about 10 years ago from just a kind of a per student, per school district kind of a formula to a formula that basically says if you have more students in your school district from disadvantaged backgrounds, you receive more funding. And there's a set of formulas that weight that funding to those school districts. The state had reached, there was sort of a goal set of reaching a total amount of funding for LCFF. We actually hit that total back a few years ago during the surplus years. There's obviously going to be some change to that because the reduction in the minimum guarantee is going to make some change there. So, there's obviously an impact, but I think part of what the governor is doing is trying to protect those investments in LCFF and in K through 12 overall. That's why there's that $8 billion issue that I was raising earlier. So we'll see. I think there's a lot of back and forth around what's going to happen on that front. The Legislative Analyst Office has already said they think that there's a better way to approach funding for K through 14, so we don't have to have as much impact on the non-education side of the budget. So I think we're going to see some changes to what's been proposed already.
Thank you, Chris. Great. Well, that was a really good conversation. I really want to appreciate Chris and Marvin for this very informative and insightful conversation today. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us and for all the work that you do to help our communities understand the budget and the process. It's extremely important for our partners to have this information and appreciate all the resources. Just as a reminder, we will have all of these resources in an email to you tomorrow, including the recording, the slides, and some links to the resources that have been mentioned. Thank you for joining us for this first webinar of the 2024 Policy Perspective Series. We hope that you will be able to join us at a future webinar. We do want you to take a minute to please fill out the survey that we're going to put up on the screen right now. There's a QR code that will take you to the survey. Your feedback is extremely important. It really helps us shape these conversations, these webinars, and we really hope that you will take a minute to fill it out. It doesn't take very long. Thank you again for your time, and we really hope to see you soon at the next one. Have a good day, everyone, and this will conclude our program.